Hello, this is Nikki Going, and I'm recording a presentation on At a Funeral by Dennis Brutus. Please remember that Dennis Brutus was a man of color, and he lived in South Africa, and he set this poem during apartheid South Africa. Apartheid was at its height when he wrote the poem. Also, please remember that this is one of the 12 NSC matric poems, and that the NSC generally sets at least 2 African poems in the poetry section of the literature paper. So although I cannot guarantee what will or won't be asked, there is a very good chance that this will be one of the poems that is asked on. So I hope that you find this presentation useful, and if you have any questions, you are welcome to email me. Also, please remember to subscribe and to like this page so that I can continue to produce videos that will be useful to you. Thank you. So some notes on the poet Dennis Brutus. He was born in Zimbabwe, which was then called Rhodesia, on the 28th of November in 1924. He moved to South Africa when he was 4 years old with his parents, and he was immediately classified as colored by the South African government because he had such a mixed, diverse ancestry. He had Khoi, French, Dutch, English, German, and Malaysian relatives. He went on to attend Fort Hare University and Wits, where he studied English and law. He then became an activist, an educator, a journalist, and a poet. He started off by teaching English and Afrikaans in various high schools, but he was fired in 1948 because he criticized apartheid and the apartheid government. He then went to work against the government's Coloured Affairs Department, and he formed the South African Sports Association in 1959, which worked to boycott racially segregated national and international sports. And it's worth noticing that he was classified as coloured, which in South Africa is not actually a derogatory term, but in countries like the United States, the word coloured is considered to be offensive. In South Africa, it means someone of biracial descent who has an English or sometimes an Afrikaans heritage and has a mixed ancestry. Right, some other points about Dennis Brutus. He founded SANROC, the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, in 1962. And the whole point of SANROC was to prevent apartheid South Africa from participating in the Olympics. And he was banned for his SANROC activities in 1961 and was forbidden to write, teach, or publish anything in South Africa. He tried to escape arrest in 1963, and as he was running away, he was shot in the back by a policeman. And he lay bleeding on a pavement in the center of Johannesburg for half an hour until a so-called black ambulance arrived to take him to hospital, because even ambulances were racially segregated under apartheid. He was then jailed on Robben Island for 16 months, and his cell was actually next to Nelson Mandela's. Of those 16 months, he spent 5 months in solitary confinement, and he also worked in the limestone quarry on the island. He was later awarded the Mbari Poetry Prize, awarded to a black poet of distinction, for his first collection of poems, Sirens, Knuckles, and Boots, which he published in Nigeria in 1963 while he was in prison. And he actually refused to accept that prize because he saw that racial classification was the ultimate source of pain in South Africa, and he didn't want to be labeled as black or colored. So it's quite important to remember that, unlike many people of color, he took no pride in having that label of colored or black. And he saw labeling people by race categories as the ultimate in evil and causing suffering. He went into exile in 1965 after he'd been released from prison, and he first went into exile in the UK and then in the USA. And he continued to work for the boycotting of segregated sports in South Africa and to publish anti-apartheid articles and protest poetry. So that was how he protested against the apartheid government. And once South Africa had transitioned to a democratic government, he returned, and then he was invited to be inducted into the South African Sports Hall of Fame on December 2007. But he very publicly rejected his nomination at the induction ceremony. So you can imagine the embarrassment, saying it is incompatible to have those who championed racist sport alongside its genuine victims. It's time, indeed long past time, for sports, truth, apologies, and reconciliation. So he knew that the apartheid government was passionate about sport, particularly rugby, and one of his ways of hurting them was to attack sport and to have it boycotted, which meant that overseas teams wouldn't come and play in South Africa, and South Africa was not allowed to enter into the Olympics. And his other form of protest was to write this extremely eloquent, powerful poetry. And he has been described as one of South Africa's best and most famous poets. He died in Cape Town on the 28th of December 2009, but his legacy lives on. Okay, so I'm just going to read the poem to you, and please excuse the fact that this is a poem read by a white South African woman when it was written by a man of color. But hopefully you will hear Dennis Brutus's words and sentiments echoing through mine. So at a funeral, Dennis Brutus. Black, green, and gold at sunset, pageantry and stubbled graves, expectant of eternity. In brides white, nuns' white veils, the nurses gush their bounty of red wine cloaks, frothing the bugled, dirging slopes. Salute, then ponder all this hollow panoply, for one whose gifts the mud devours with our hopes. O all you frustrate ones, powers tombed in dirt, aborted not by death, but carrion books of birth. Arise, the brassy shout of freedom stirs our earth. Not death, but death-head tyranny scythes our ground, and plots our narrow cells of pain, defeat, and dearth. Better that we should die than that we should lie down. And this was published in a collection of poems called A Simple Lust, published by Heinemann in 1973. And please note that Dennis Brutus wrote this poem in memory of Valencia Majombozi, who died shortly after she had qualified to become a doctor. And she was a black woman doctor who had managed to qualify as a doctor in apartheid South Africa, which was a huge achievement because it was very difficult for women at the time to become doctors, never mind if they were of color. And what he's expressing here, and we will get to, is that enormous sense of loss and frustration that this woman who would have done so much good for her community, who had qualified as a doctor in order to help her community, was now dead. And he's describing her funeral. If you are worried about what some of the words mean, don't worry, I will go through it in detail and then you will get a better understanding. So before we start, I wanted to show you some pictures that will hopefully give you an idea of some of the imagery and make some of it easier to understand. So this first one is a painting by a famous South African painter, George Pemba, and it's called ANC Funeral in Red Location, Port Elizabeth. And it was painted in 1965. And one of the things I'd like you to notice is the sense of ceremony, aka pageantry, in this funeral. And then also look at the colors of the ANC flag, black, green, and gold. And whenever someone died who was a member of the ANC and who had been fighting for the freedom of and equal rights of everyone in South Africa under apartheid, they would be buried in a very ceremonial funeral where their coffin would be covered with the ANC flag, where people would be carrying ANC flags, and where they would be singing freedom songs. And often those funerals were considered to be illegal gatherings and were forcibly broken up by the South African police at the time. They would fire rubber bullets, they would fire tear gas, and many times the eulogies at the funerals were very political speeches because it was a recognition that this person had died fighting for the freedom of his or her countrymen or women. Okay, this is another painting by George Pember. It's called At the Clinic. It was done in 1979. And I like this painting because it gives you a view of what a nurse would have traditionally worn at the time. So a long white dress, a little white cap, sometimes quite lacy, and then a red cloak, which you can just see over the back of her shoulders. This slide shows you some pictures of an ANC funeral, so you can see what I was talking about. The ANC flag's been waved, all the colors of the ANC, the red, the gold, and the green. This slide also shows you some more images from the poem. So the poem mentions a bugler. So there you can see someone playing a bugle on the right, and often they would have played a tune known as the Last Post, which is a traditional piece of music played when a soldier was buried. So although these people that were buried in ANC military funerals weren't formally soldiers, because the ANC was a banned organization, they were regarded by the people of South Africa who were fighting for their freedom and their rights as soldiers. And so often they were buried in what looked like a formal military funeral with many of those rites and rituals. This is just a picture of a very unkept graveyard. You can see that the grass is overgrown and that the grass has been hacked short so that it forms what we call stubble, and I'll explain more of that to you later. Then another image that appears in the poem is this image of the Grim Reaper. So the Grim Reaper is a personification of death that often crops up in English poetry, and death is usually portrayed as this figure with a face that is made of a skull, and he's carrying this instrument, this agricultural tool called a scythe or a sickle. Okay, in this poem it's referred to as a scythe, and a scythe was used to harvest crops. So you would basically swing that scythe and it would chop down the wheat or the oats or the barley or whatever it was that you were harvesting. And the reason that death is usually personified as carrying a scythe is because death is portrayed as the Grim Reaper. He's the grim harvester, and the crop that he harvests is human souls. The imagery on the right is a Totenkopf badge, that's that badge on top, which is the skull and crossbones, that actually appeared on Nazi uniforms, particularly the uniforms worn by the SS soldiers in Hitler's Nazi regime. And you can see that they were pretty much, they made a cult out of death. And one of the things that Dennis Brutus comments on in this poem is how the apartheid government really admired the Nazi government. And in fact, many of the laws that were promulgated under apartheid were based on the Nazi Nuremberg laws. So those laws that forced people to live in certain areas, those laws that banned people of color from most forms of employment, from much access to education and to amenities like hospitals and schools and shops. Those were all laws that were based on the Nuremberg laws. And the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany had originally been brought in to segregate the Jewish population from the rest of the German population. And the apartheid government used their apartheid laws to segregate people of color and separate them from white South Africans. And then they proceeded to give white South Africans a lot more rights and benefits than people of color in apartheid South Africa. This is just a picture of some of the protests at the time, because in 1952 laws were passed to force all black South Africans over the age of 16 to carry an internal passport known as a passbook, or in Afrikaans a dompas, meaning dumb pass. And the passbook contained the person's name, their identity details, their photograph, fingerprints, details of their employers, and details of where they were allowed to be in so-called white areas. And any black person found in a white area without a passbook faced the possibility of being evicted, deported, imprisoned, or disappeared. Many people left home and they just never came home because the security police actually locked them up and then sometimes murdered them. And there were many protests in South Africa by people of color against passbooks and against the apartheid laws. So there's just some pictures there on the left to show you some of those protests. I will now discuss the poem line by line, and hopefully this will give you a much better idea of the imagery and the power of Brutus's language. So the first two lines are black, green, and gold at sunset pageantry, and stubbled graves expectant of eternity. So black, green, and gold, as you can see from the picture, are the colors of the ANC flags, and sunset, literally the end of the day, but we also talk about the sunset of a person's life. So sunset has connotations of darkness, sadness, and death. And a pageant is a form of public entertainment, usually where people are very happy and they're wearing elaborate costumes. So think about a beauty pageant. So this implies that this funeral is a very formal ceremony with lots of symbolic clothing, lots of rituals, and that it literally occurs at sunset, but metaphorically it occurs at sunset of the person's life who is being buried, that Victoria Mjombozi. Then the next line, and stubbled graves expectant of eternity. So stubble is the stalks of crops that are left out after the earth has been harvested. Or if you think about when someone shaves, their stubble is those little spiky hairs that are left over. So when the poet talks about stubbled graves, I think literally it gives you this image in your head of spikes sticking out of the ground, like the gravestones are like stubble on the face of the earth, metaphorically. But also stubble is what's left over after harvesting. So it can also tie in with that idea of the Grim Reaper has harvested his crop of people, and the stubble is the gravestones that is all that remains of the people that are now dead. The word expectant is ambiguous. Remember that ambiguous means two possible meanings, and it can mean that either the graves, which are personified, are expecting eternity, or that the mourners that are surrounding the graves at the funeral are expecting eternity, because it's not clear whether the graves are expectant or the pageantry of the mourners and the priests are expectant. And if it's the second one, where it's the mourners that are expectant, then they believe in an afterlife. And it's a very clever line, because if we're talking about the graves being expectant of eternity, that implies that this is the death of all hope. You know, Victoria is gone for good. Everything that she once represented by way of hope is gone. It no longer is even possible. Whereas if it's the mourners that are expectant of eternity, then that has positive implications. Victoria has died. She's no longer on the earth, but she looks over the people she's left behind from the afterlife, which would tie in with the traditional African emphasis on the ancestors still being part of the community, still looking after people and looking out for people. The next two lines, in brides white, nuns white veils, the nurses gush their bounty of red wine cloaks, frothing the bugled, dirging slopes. So this is quite a complex image. And it presents to us the idea of this graveyard being in a hollow surrounded by the slopes of low hills. And on the slopes, you've got many, many nurses. And historically, there were probably hundreds of nurses at this funeral because they had come to mourn this young doctor that they had worked with. And the old-fashioned nurse's outfit was a white dress with a short white veil and a red cloak. So you can imagine all that white lining this bowl of hills looks like froth that churned up water, that you can see in the central picture. And then their red cloaks looks like red wine, so red wine with a froth of white. And of course, red has connotations, it has cultural implications of blood and suffering and passion. Okay, and wine is an ancient symbol of sacrifice and hospitality. So there's this idea that Victoria is a sacrifice for her people. And of course, the connotations of brides and nuns and white is innocence, purity, holiness, a new life. So again, you can see that Dennis Brutus is playing with negative and positive connotations of this death. Okay, a dirge is a very mournful song for the dead, usually sung as part of a funeral ceremony. And here, the land itself seems to be singing a dirge because the slopes are the slopes around the graveyard. So it's as though the land is mourning this young doctor. And of course, a bugle is the musical instrument that was traditionally used to play the last post, which was usually played at night as a signal for soldiers to go to bed, or when there was a military funeral. And I've put the question here, why is this appropriate for this doctor's funeral? Well, she was seen as someone who died in the cause. She was on the forefront of fighting for her people, not literally fighting with violence, but fighting against illness and poverty and disease. And so she was given a hero's burial, a soldier's burial. And they might have even played the last post for that. Or certainly Brutus would have thought it was appropriate for this young fighter for the human rights of people of color in South Africa. And if you want to hear what the last post sounds like, I advise you to just go onto your search engine and enter last post audio clip, and then you can hear it. It's a very beautiful piece of music. Lines 5 and 6 read, "Salute, then ponder all this hollow panoply for one whose gifts the mud devours with our hopes." Salute means to honor or to salute a person, usually a soldier in a military context. And here the salute is to the dead. And the salute would be not the traditional salute that one associates with the military, but the Black Power salute. So you can imagine at an ANC funeral, everyone raising their fists in the air, their clenched fists, and shouting Amandla Awetu, which is power to the people. And this is the salute of solidarity that's also associated with the Communist Party. So the idea behind this salute is that we are all one, we are all comrades. And the line starts off with quite a positive tone because the next couple of words are then ponder. And to ponder means to think deeply, usually about something serious. And then the tone changes because it goes to all this hollow panoply. And hollow means literally empty, but metaphorically meaningless, pointless. And panoply is a splendid display. So the poet is mocking this splendid ceremonial display of this funeral and saying that it seems to be utterly pointless. And you can see that in the next line, his tone descends into absolute despair. And he uses this image that some of you might recognize from Romeo and Juliet. For one whose gifts the mud devours with all our hopes. So one is obviously this young doctor, this Victoria, and then the mud and the earth of the graveyard is personified as being this ravenous person or beast that eats the dead. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the graves are described as hungry maws. A maw is like an animal's mouth. And here, the graves don't only devour or greedily eat up the dead and Victoria, they also consume the hopes of all the people that are at the funeral. And I think here Dennis Brutus is really highlighting how at the height of apartheid, it felt to the people that were fighting against apartheid and fighting for their rights that this was a situation that was never going to end. And they must have gone through times when they felt utterly hopeless, especially when people were being destroyed by apartheid, both directly by the soldiers and the security forces, but also indirectly by the structural inequality of apartheid, by the huge levels of crushing poverty and poor health and malnutrition and a lack of opportunities. All of these things also had an impact on people's health and happiness and literally increased the death rate amongst people of color in South Africa. And notice that here Dennis Brutus uses two imperative verbs. So remember, when you're using an imperative verb, the mood of the verb is known as the imperative mood. And that's just a very fancy way of saying he issues commands. The one command is to salute, and it's highlighted with that exclamation mark. And then the other one is ponder. So salute and then ponder. Okay, and there is a contrast between honoring the dead and then the implication of that all these ceremonies are, as I said, meaningless. And if you look at the poet's choice of words, remember that the technical term for that is diction, and his tone, the emotional quality of his words, you can see how there is a shift in his attitude to the funeral and to the death of the doctor. So he shifts from being admiring and celebratory to being utterly hopeless and helpless and devastated. And I think there's also an element of real anger and rage at the complete waste of this young woman's life. The next slide, lines 7 and 8 are, "O all ye frustrate ones, powers tombed in dirt, aborted not by death, but carrion books of birth." So here the poet calls the dead the frustrate ones. Notice, not frustrated. Okay, so to frustrate means to prevent the success of something or to cause enormous irritation and anger. And here the dead are described as a verb, as frustrate, which is interesting because it implies that they're still capable of frustrating the apartheid government, of causing them frustration, of stopping them from doing what they want to do. The dead are active here. They're not passive. You have to be active to carry out a verb. And then he also describes the dead as powers tombed in dirt. So they still have their power, even though they are locked up in the grave or the tomb of mud and dirt. So again, there is that shift in tone. He then says that the dead have not been aborted by death, but by carrion books of birth. And this line needs a little bit of explanation. So abortion, as you probably know, is the deliberate ending of the life of a fetus in a pregnancy. But you can also abort an action or an operation. So metaphorically, to abort means to cut short, to kill before something can fully come to fruition or to achieve its full potential. And the interesting thing is that he says it's not death personified. You remember that figure with his scythe that kills these people. It is the carrion books of birth. And that's another interesting paradox. Remember, a paradox is language that seems to be contradictory and illogical, but it actually tells greater truth. Because the word carrion means decaying or dead animals, and it's usually the decaying or dead animal that has been killed by a predator. And here he's describing the pass books, the books of birth, the ID books, as carrion. In other words, Brutus is linking them to death and destruction. Okay, so he implies that apartheid and the laws of apartheid that enforced the passbook laws are actually more deadly and more corrupting than death itself. And it's those passbooks that actually cut people's lives short, that abort them, not death. So, he's really ascribing a lot of power to apartheid. He's saying that apartheid has outdeathed death. Lines 9 and 10 are, arise, the brassy shout of freedom stirs our earth, not death, but death-head tyranny scythes our ground. So line 9, arise, literally means to stand up, but it's also a reference to rise up, which means to start a revolution. And it's a reference to the words that Jesus used in the Bible when he raised his friend Lazarus from the dead. And he said, arise, and then Lazarus came back from the dead. And notice that it's followed by an exclamation mark because it's imperative, it's urgent. Freedom here is capitalized, so freedom is personified, and it's personified as shouting through the bugles that were referenced earlier to wake the dead up and to stir the earth. Okay, and of course, stirring the earth, literally the dead are buried in the earth, but that's also the idea that our bodies go back to the earth when we die. So sometimes human flesh is described as earth. And notice here that the music of the bugles doesn't send the dead to their rest, it wakes them up. So you've got this paradoxical idea of the dead not being dead, the dead coming back to fight against apartheid, which seems very positive. But then line 10 is a contrast. And he says, it's not death, but death-head tyranny that scythes our ground. Okay, so remember, death is again personified, that's why it's a capital D, and he's referring to that figure of death, the grim reaper with his scythe, but he's saying that it's not this chap with his scythe that scythes the ground, that harvests humanity on behalf of death. Instead, it is the apartheid government, which he describes as death-head tyranny. And when he describes them as death-head tyranny, he's linking them to the Totenkopf. That literally means death head in German. And it was the badge on the SS soldiers, the Nazi soldiers' clothing. And he's saying that the apartheid government is just like the Nazi dictatorship in World War II. It's tyrannical. And remember, a tyrant is a ruthless, cruel dictator. And he's saying that the apartheid government is actually doing death's job for death. And the apartheid government is the actual grim reaper that scythes our ground. And of course, our ground is again an important reference to our land, the land of South Africa, that the people of color under apartheid had largely been excluded from. But remember, earlier he describes how the land mourns this young doctor. So although apartheid has driven people off the land, they haven't lost that connection to the land. And of course, it's a reference to the Group Areas Act, which excluded people from the land under apartheid. Then lines 11 and 12, which are, and plots our narrow cells of pain, defeat, and dearth, and there's a colon, better that we should die than that we should lie down. So plots are small pieces of land, for example, the plot or piece of land where a grave is dug. But you can also understand plots as a verb. So to plot means to plan something, often something evil. And then a cell is a very small room. So we could talk about prison cells or the cells in which nuns or monks sleep. So a cell is an image of imprisonment and of impoverishment, of a lack of wealth. So when he talks about narrow cells of pain, he could be referencing the graves in the graveyard, or the prison cells where prisoners, particularly political prisoners under the apartheid government, had been jailed, or the very small houses that disadvantaged people were forced into under the Group Areas Act during apartheid, so people of color. And I think it's very deliberate that Brutus allows you to interpret this line in three different ways. That's why he's such a great poet. His language is really dense, it's layered. There's all these levels of meaning that you can read into it, and they all work. And the most important thing here is that it's a continuation of the idea that pain, suffering, and death are not accidental in South Africa under apartheid. They are actually plotted and planned and orchestrated, implemented by the apartheid government. They are weapons of the apartheid government. And remember, dearth means shortage of basic necessities, usually food. So you often talk about dearth in times of famine or times of starvation. And then also look at how he uses alliteration. He uses it throughout the poem, but this is a good example that defeat and dearth and die and down all have that hard thudding D sound, which makes it sound really brutal, really harsh. And whenever you're going to talk about alliteration, talk about the effect. So in the final line of the poem, he says, and that comes after the colon, after dearth. So a colon means more information or an explanation is coming. Better that we should die than we should lie down. Now, if a person lies down, literally, it means to lie down, but metaphorically, it means that you surrender. If you think about it, when a person is attacked and they give up or they are injured or killed, they will usually fall down so that they're lying on the ground. Or they're made to lie down so that they can be arrested, because if you're lying down, you can't fight. And here, the poet implies that it's better that the people who were resisting apartheid would resist until they died, perhaps even die because they were resisting, rather than giving up or surrendering. And you can see that this is a tribute to Victoria Majambozi. He's saying that she lived a good life because she just died. She didn't lie down. She didn't submit. She didn't surrender. She didn't give up. Now, in some versions of the poem, there is a full stop after down. In this version, which I've got from a copy of Brutus's original documents, there was no full stop. And to me, that implies that there's no end to resistance and no surrender. This final line also implies that the poet has finally come to terms with the tragedy of the young doctor's death. She died rather than choosing to surrender. And the poet is saying, this is better. And not only is this poem a protest poem, it's also a call to arms. It's motivational. He's saying through this poem, through this young woman's example, to the people that were resisting apartheid, don't give up. It's better that you die in the struggle than that you just surrender. And also notice that he brings himself into that conversation. He uses the pronoun we. So he's talking about everyone who was fighting against apartheid, himself included. Dennis Brutus had to say about this poem. He said, it's about a young woman called Valencia Majambozi, an African woman who managed to qualify as a doctor after enormous hardships and sacrifice by her parents. Her mother took in washing and ironing, did the cleaning of apartment buildings, and put her through university. She got her medical degree, and then, by an incredible irony, just after Valencia had completed her internship, she died. I went to her funeral. The poem is about the years of sacrifice that end in nothing, and you could read the poem entirely on that level, as just an expression of frustrated and aborted hopes. So again, he refers to frustrate and abortion, which is the language of the poem. But you notice he says you can read it that way. That's not the only way to read it. And then the question I asked you was, do you agree that this poem is just an expression of frustrated and aborted hopes? Consider the poet's use of paradox and irony in your response. So remember that paradox is a statement that seems to be impossible and illogical, but it actually tells a greater truth. So a good example is the idiom, the child is the father of the man. Logically, a child cannot be a man's father or his or her own father, but it means that a person's experiences and upbringing as a child will shape who and what they become as an adult. And of course, irony means that what is said or written is the opposite of what's actually true. So, for example, if I was talking to you and I told you you can relax, you can be safe, but while I'm talking, the ceiling above me is on fire and about to collapse, that would be ironic. What I said is the opposite of what the reality is. So always remember that when you're discussing irony, you need to explain three things: what is said or meant, what the truth or reality actually is. So your answer is going to usually contain the word but, because you're looking for an opposite or a contradiction. And then finally, what is the purpose or the effect of this irony, which is often criticism or satire. And if you're going to talk about paradox, you need to say what seems to be illogical, but what the greater truth actually is. And again, your third step, what is the effect of the paradox? Why has the author or poet chosen to use that particular poetic technique? And how does that reinforce his point? So if you were going to answer this question, for example, for a poetry essay or a 3-mark question in a contextual test, you would go and look carefully through the poem for examples where there seems to be a contradiction or an opposite. And then you can discuss the irony and or paradox in those lines. And think about why the poet has chosen to go with irony and paradox. And I suppose it's because of his conflicting emotions. I mean, this isn't the only correct answer, but it's an idea for you. On one level, he's filled with admiration at this amazing life this young woman led. You know, all the obstacles she must have had to overcome as a black woman in apartheid to become qualified as a medical doctor, particularly when her mother was earning very little money and had to somehow pay for it. And that is contrasted with the enormous sense of loss and frustration when she dies before she can even use her training. So that's one paradox. Then there's also the paradox of the fact that the dead are dead, they're gone, they can no longer fight back. But they do fight back in a way because they inspire the living to continue with the resistance. They become martyrs. So they become very powerful symbols of resistance. And now that they're dead, there is literally nothing else that the apartheid government can do to them. So that's one way of approaching that question. But bear in mind, this is a language that we're discussing, and there are multiple possible meanings. And the only thing that is wrong is things that you cannot prove and you cannot substantiate from the text. This is another interesting comment that Dennis Brutus made about his poem. He said, "I saw a film in South Africa called Judgment at Nuremberg. It begins with the tanks rolling through the streets of Berlin with the panzer divisions whose insignia was a skull and crossbones, the death's head, the Totenkopf." You saw that badge in the slides, being wildly cheered by the audience. The Nazis are regarded as great heroes by the South African regime, and people imitate them. The Nazis are the model for how one should behave if you are a white in South Africa. I was trying to say that it is not the physical event of death which destroys the blacks. Their destruction does not come from death, which I capitalize, because he's personifying death, but from a tyranny which is associated with the death's head, the Totenkopf, the Nazis. I'm saying it's the Nazi system in South Africa which destroys people, and that they are destroyed even before they die. So the question I asked there was, do you think it's possible to be destroyed before you die? How can this happen? Is it a choice? And here, this is a typical exam or test question. Justify your response with references to the poem, which is just a very fancy way of saying, look at the poem, find examples, quote the examples in quotation marks, and then explain how they prove that what you are saying is true. So if you ever get asked to justify, it simply means prove what you are saying is true by giving evidence from the poem. And I think one of the things you could think about in answering this question is that idea of sometimes people not only die, but they never get a chance to actually live. And what does that really mean? So this is another comment from the poet himself about his poem. You can see how one could look at the poem simply as a description of the funeral of a particular person, or you could see it operating at another level, as a poem which is making a political statement. In the last two lines, I'm anticipating prison. I anticipate the narrow cells, and I assume that in resistance to the system, it is necessary to go to prison. Then I conclude by saying, better that we should die than we should lie down. That's a very conscious change of mood and tempo to make the concluding statement. So, on the one hand, there is the sadness. He knows he's going to go to prison, and that many resistance fighters will go to prison. And then he changes it up and he's saying, but it's better to fight back than to surrender. So it becomes very motivational and quite powerful. So the question I asked here is At a Funeral a protest poem, an elegy, or both? Refer to the diction, imagery, and structure of the poem to substantiate your answer. So that is a typical poetry essay question. So things you would need to remember if you're going to answer that is that a protest poem is a poem that is written to protest or object to a political or social problem. Note that not all protest poets were protesting against apartheid, and not all protest poems were set in South Africa and about apartheid. You could choose any war-torn part of the world, and you'd probably find that there are people there writing protest poems, even today, where they're protesting the suffering that they're experiencing. An elegy is a poem written to praise a dead person and to celebrate their legacy or their achievements of their lives. And elegies usually have a sad or solemn tone. Diction means choice of words. Imagery refers to sensory imagery, so what sights, sounds, tastes, smells, or textures does the poet describe? And to the use of non-literal or metaphorical comparisons, like similes, metaphors, or personification. And notice that protest poems can be elegies as well. You know, poems are not always only one particular format or structure. And structure also refers to how the poem is laid out. So does it have a regular rhyme scheme? Does it have a regular rhythm scheme? If it does have a rhyme scheme, which words rhyme? You can even do your A, B, C, D analysis to show which lines rhyme. And does it have a regular, consistent number of syllables in each line? Because if each line is more or less the same number of syllables or an identical number of syllables, you're going to get a very regular rhythm. Does it speed up because you've got long words with long vowel sounds? Or, sorry, that would make it slow down. Or does it speed up because you've got short words with short sounds? What impact does the punctuation have on the poem? Do you have enjambment where you've got lines that sentences that run on from one line to the next. You know, there's some poems where you've got one sentence for an entire poem, and it's a 12-line poem. And the effect of enjambment is that you usually have this little pause at the end of each sentence. So sometimes that shifts the meaning at the beginning or the end of a line. It also tends to slow the rhythm down. So those are all things that you can think about and talk about if you're going to discuss the structure of this poem. And I would recommend that in preparation for exams, you bullet point plan a few poetry essays, just in case you absolutely hate the contextual questions, or you're better at writing essays than answering contextual questions, which does sometimes happen. And I've just included this because I think it's a beautiful poem, and it tells you something about Dennis Brutus. You don't need to know this for an exam or a test, and you don't need to know all the biographical information for Dennis Brutus, but it gives you an idea of who he was and therefore meanings behind what he wrote. So this is another poem he wrote. Freedom is an appetite, a lust which we have, and if you can't have it, you'd rather die than go without freedom, which is exactly what he wrote in those last two lines of At a Funeral. And so I wrote this poem about it. A simple lust is all my woe, the thin thread of agony that runs through the veins after the flesh is overspent in overtaxing acts of love. Only I speak the other's woe, those congealed in concrete or rotting in rusted ghetto shacks. Only I speak their wordless woe, their unarticulated, simple lust. And a lust is a driving hunger or passion. Here he's talking about the lust for freedom, the appetite for freedom. Brutus was arguably Africa's greatest and most influential modern poet after Leopold Sedar Senghor and Christopher Okigbo, certainly the most widely read, and no doubt among the world's finest poets of all time. More than that, he was a fearless campaigner for justice, a relentless organizer, an incorrigible romantic, and a great humanist and teacher. And that was a quote from another writer, Olu Ogoebi, who is the interim director of the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Connecticut. So, as a South African, I think we can be very proud of Dennis Brutus and of his courage, and he was an amazing man. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I've created this channel so that any learner or teacher who's working with a South African NSC curriculum can have access to teaching and detailed learning materials for free. If you would like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe, and then you will receive a notification every time I post new materials, and also pass the link on to any of your friends who would find this useful. You're also very welcome to make a small donation to support this work. To do so, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. Thank you, and I look forward to my next presentation with you.